Hi there, Colin Hall. Today I'm going to think out loud about just why have Labour been so rubbish in their first year. Now, I know I said that this was a non-partisan channel, and it is, and I don't ask that question because I want to beat up Labour, but I'm genuinely curious how it is that a political party has come into power with a massive majority, has had years to look at what's going on in the political landscape, decide how to do things better, and then come in and basically messed up almost everything, with the possible exception of foreign policy and managing Trump, where I think Keir Starmer's done a fairly good job. So it's worth taking a step back and looking at how politics works in this country. So we have our Prime Minister, we have Parliament, and we have ministers who are responsible for their departments, and their departments are filled with non-political appointees, i.e. the civil service, and they are the continuation between one party and the next, one government to the next, so that things don't fall apart when we have a transition of government. So that's fairly simple to understand. So if you look at the incoming ministers, those who are responsible for their departments, well, I think of the 30 cabinet members, only one's ever worked in industry, and only one, I think, or possibly two, has ever had any experience at cabinet level. So you have a bunch of people who have never run an organisation, have no experience of running government, are suddenly in charge of hundreds of billions of pounds of spend. Now think about the commercial sphere. Think about if you got given a multi-billion pound company in this country, but were told, yeah, and all the top people have resigned, so you've got to fill every position. And you fill them with people who've never done the job, have never run an organisation, don't really know how it works. And then what do you think that company will do? Do you think it will thrive, or do you think it will crash and burn? And that's a bit like what's happening at the moment. And that's simply a function of our governmental system. So that's not really Labour's fault from that perspective. However, who it chooses to be its MPs, who it chooses to become its ministers is. Now, there's a mechanism in this country for bringing in talent that isn't an MP. So usually ministers are MPs, but every now and again the government decides, you know what, we really need someone who knows what they're talking about. And then we have the House of Lords, because you can pick a Lord to be a minister if you wish. And if they're not already in the House of Lords, you can make them a Lord and then bring them in. So this has been done in the past. Most recently it was done with Lord Cameron, our former Prime Minister, who was brought in by Rishi Sunak in order to become foreign minister for a brief period of time, because he needed that international stage expertise. We've done it before with things like trade secretaries, trade ministers, where we needed somebody who really understood business, and then we made them a lord and brought them into the cabinet. So there's mechanisms of bringing in talent if you need to, but such people are often not politically tied to your party, and that makes them dangerous mavericks. And prime ministers don't like that because they can show them up with their knowledge, so they tend not to use it, which is a shame, because it is a way to bring in talent. So that goes some way to explaining how Labour have messed up. And it's interesting to note that Reform have seen this, and so they've hired a bunch of advisors to help them specifically with things like how to draft legislation, what to do to manage the civil service, so that if and when they win, which they are currently heading the polls, so it's a possibility, they don't make the same mistakes Labour does, albeit they'll have the same problem of having candidates, ministers who probably will have had little or no experience of managing major organisations, certainly not in government. So that's part of the problem. And the other thing is there are 4 constituencies or groupings that you need to pay very close, almost day-to-day attention to. And this government, and Keir Starmer in particular, has done a very bad job of doing so, and it's coming to bite him on the butt on a regular basis. So what are those 4 constituencies? Well, number 1, it's your own backbenchers. If you don't look after them, they rebel or do stupid things that hurt you. Number 2 is the civil service. The civil service in this country is incredibly powerful, and if they're not absolutely on board with what you're doing, they can actually stop all your plans in their tracks. Number 3 is the bond market. The bond market will kill any government and can ruin the career of any Prime Minister. Look at Liz Truss. And 4 is the media. So how have Labour done so badly with those? Well, apparently, Keir Starmer, looking at the backbenchers, spends far less time in the House of Parliament, far less time talking to his backbenchers than his predecessors. So, say Tony Blair, he was always in and around Parliament talking to his backbenchers. And there are some Labour backbenchers who say they've never even spoken to the man. Now, even with a large majority, and perhaps also because of a large majority, once your backbenchers believe or think that you're ignoring them or don't understand what you're doing because you've stopped communicating with them, they start asking questions, awkward questions, and if they're not answered correctly, they will then start to cause problems. And it's exactly why we have issues with Labour government having to do U-turns on things like the winter fuel allowance, PIC payments, and why it's going to be so difficult for them to be able to find any kind of savings on welfare or any other costs, which is going to have knock-on effects to taxes, borrowing, etc. later this year. So that's the first constituency, which they have failed at. The second one is the civil service. And the civil service provides continuity between governments, incoming, outgoing governments, and they are the ones that actually have to do all the work to bring your plans as a government to fruition. And if the civil service doesn't think that you're doing the right thing, what happens is they pay lip service, say yes sir, and they don't do anything. And then when you asked 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks later, well, what's happening with this? They say, oh, sorry, yes, it wasn't, didn't realise it was such a big priority. We've been doing all these things, but we'll get back onto it. And they can delay, they can make things difficult, they can come up with a million reasons why what you want to do is not a good idea. Now, that's very undemocratic, and I'm afraid it's part of the problem we have with this country at the moment. And anything that we need to do to make this country better, however you want to define better, is going to have to involve reform of the civil service, but that's a discussion for another day. But if you don't manage the civil service carefully, if you have good relations, if you don't make individual civil service employees accountable, nothing happens that they don't want to happen. The third group is the bond market. We've already seen what happens if you do something that the bond market doesn't like or is surprised by with the Liz Truss brief prime ministership. And the bond market is incredibly powerful. And if you don't understand how the bond market works, it's very simple. Like the FTSE, where you can buy and sell shares in a company, you can also buy and sell debt, particularly government debt in this case, which is referred to as gilts. And at the moment in this country, we have massive debts. The highest we've seen in most people's living memory. And we also pay higher interest than equivalent wealthy nations. And part of that is because the bond market has no faith in either the general economy or in the government's plans. And so what happens is they think, a bit risky than everyone else, we're going to have to charge you more. And that means it's much more difficult to borrow, which is another reason why we'll probably be seeing high taxes in the autumn as the next budget statement. And if you don't pay attention to the bond markets, if you don't manage the bond markets, then they will punish you really, really badly, and it can cost careers. So they've done slightly better manage the bond markets than they have with their own backbenchers, but not a lot. And the fourth constituency you need to manage is the media, or more specifically, the narrative that's going out there. Now, you cannot control the media, they are their own thing, but you can at least get ahead of problems and steer or influence the narrative. Now, in an ideal world, it wouldn't matter, you could carry on because results are what's important, not just what people are saying, but narratives have power. And if you don't manage them correctly, they take on a life on their own, and suddenly you find that the bond markets react, your own backbenchers react, the public react, and then you lose control of whatever the situations you're trying to manage. And apparently, Keir Starmer spends very little time paying attention to the media. He doesn't read the papers with the same interest and passion as previous prime ministers, and as a result, he misses things.
Morning.
Morning. So those are the 4 things that any incoming government needs to pay attention to, and I would give the Labour government probably a D- on most of them, and maybe a B- on the bond market. So that goes a long way to explain just why Labour have been so shit. On that note, see you soon.